framing an innocent party of a crime. It is the construction of an event. In other words, it is events that would not happen naturally. They are constructed. They are instigated for the purposes of framing an innocent party of a crime. That is what a false flag is. And once that innocent party is considered to be guilty of the crime, even though they are innocent, a war usually happens against that party with untold, unthinkable bloodshed. This has been done since the beginning of time, but today it is largely being done by the American deep state for the purposes of the globalist agenda. In other words, the globalists, the elite billionaire class of the world, they have commandeered our government, the government that belongs to us, to implement their bloody agenda against our interests and against the interests of the people of the world. And the party that they have picked, the innocent party that they have picked, they have picked to frame for these crimes, the globalists frame the Muslim populations of the world. That's who they pick. They frame that group, and then wars ensue. And the reason that they picked the Muslim populations of the world is because in the 1950s, this is one reason, in the 1950s, there was a nationalist trend happening in those countries. The Middle Eastern countries were largely implementing a nationalist agenda. And a nationalist agenda runs against the interests of the globalists. The globalists do not like nationalists because what the nationalists want, they want a set of independent countries, a world made up of a diversified set of independent countries. That's what a nationalist agenda is. It means that your country exists for itself and your leaders advocate on your behalf. That's what a nationalist agenda is. And that was happening. And the globalists don't like that, so they picked this group to frame for these crimes. And one example of this is Egypt in the 1950s, and it's called the Levant Affair. And what happened is, at that time, the president of Egypt was a man named Gamal Abdel Nasser. And President Nasser of Egypt in the 1950s was implementing the nationalist agenda, which goes against the globalist agenda. Nationalists, and I'm going to repeat this one more time, nationalists believe in a diversified world of independent nations, and he wanted Egypt to stand independent of the globalist agenda and the globalist idea of a one world government. President Nasser wanted for the Egyptian people, he wanted the protection of local industry. He wanted a strong military that is kept at home and only used for defense, never for offense. He wanted a formidable border to protect the people of Egypt from any outside threat. All of those ideas go against the globalist agenda, and so the Levant Affair was initiated. And what the Levant Affair was it was a false flag attack where there was a plot to bomb innocent people in Egypt and then frame it on practicing Muslims. Thankfully, this plot was thwarted when Israeli and Egyptian leaders came together and exposed this threat and put it down. However, it does show the intent of the globalists. They will frame any innocent party in order to meet their ends. And we have to ask the question here. In America, we have to ask the question, is this happening today in America? Are false flags happening in America today? Because here in America, we are in an ideological struggle between the globalists and the nationalists, and you can see it every day. President Trump introduced the concept of a nationalist country in America. He introduced the America First concept, just like President Nasser did in Egypt. And today we see the establishment forces doing everything they can to take him and that movement down. And we have to ask, is this happening? But even we have to take it further and we have to ask, is it being implemented at the local level? Or is the globalist agenda being implemented at the local level? Because our local officials are our last line of defense. And their duty is to represent our interests only. And if the National Party, if the National Democrat Party, if it has been commandeered by the globalists, It is up to our local Democrats to stand up to that party and represent the people of Texas. And to answer the question, if our local Texas Democrats are implementing the nationalist agenda, it's very simple. There's just a few questions that you have to ask. Number one, do they promote the ideology of the globalists? Do they promote a hypersexualization? That's one of the foundational underpinnings of the globalist agenda, the hypersexualization of our country. That's number one. Do they regularly blame the people of Texas of being racist? If they're doing that, they're most likely implementing the globalist agenda. Do they push flu epidemics, and do they push vaccines? If they're doing these sorts of things, then they're most likely implementing the globalist agenda. And so this is a short description of of this fight that's gone on for more than 100 years between nationalists and globalists and how we all get caught up in it. But today, on today's show, we are going to have a guest, and he's going to present a false flag. He has a theory on a false flag that is a very far-reaching one, and it's not one that I agree with. I think it's too far out there. But in where we are today, I give anyone the floor. And so we have Joe Olson on today, and we also have G2. G2, are you on the line?
I am.
Okay, excellent, very good. So we have Joe Olson and G2. So Joe, you heard my description of what a false flag attack is. I'm going to hand the floor off to you. Can you tell me if I got it right? Did I describe a false flag correctly?
Yes, and as a matter of fact, what we're dealing with is something that's very biblical, the four horsemen of the apocalypse. And those four horsemen are famine, pestilence, disease, and in the Bible, it's mistranslated as death. Death is inevitable, but what is not inevitable and what can be structured is war. Currently, we have power centers in the world, mainly the banking centers, that have complete control of all four of these threat vectors. So they have famine, which they've used repeatedly throughout history, pestilence, which is a wide variety of things, including medical interventions and diseases that they're able to spread. The cover for today's program on TV, on the website, was Remember the a la mode. This is Shelley Luther, who had a rally May 9th, 2020 in Dallas after she was freed from jail for cutting hair 2 days before Governor Abbott said she could. And so I attended that rally. At that rally, I met Senator Bob Hall, our former representative from Florida, Alan West, and a Dallas area doctor named Yvette Lozano, and she was talking about the benefits of hydroxychloroquine. We don't have time to get into that today because what we're mainly focused on is something else that happened. I was watching TV, which I rarely do in the mornings. I normally listen to talk radio, but if what you want to know is the weather forecast, you only got like a 30-second window at the top and the bottom of each hour to get the weather forecast, and I missed it on the radio. I said, well, I'll just turn on Good Morning America because they're constantly showing you what the weather is. And so I turned on the TV at 9 o'clock on September 11th, and they said the the North Tower is burning. It looks like a plane has hit it. And I went, oh my God. So I call a friend of mine, I'm talking to her on the phone, and a plane hits the South Tower. And so I watched it for about an hour, and I'm talking with various friends on the phone, and the top of the South Tower leans 22 degrees. And I said, well, I'm a trained structural engineer. I've been registered in Texas for over 40 years. I've worked in hundreds of high-rise buildings in 20 different states in person, so I'm very familiar with high-rise construction. And as it leaned over 22 degrees, I said, well, gravity will take the top of the building, and it will pop the columns on one side because of tension. It will compress the others, and the top 20 floors will flop over and fall down on the ground. And then miraculously, the building tilted straight upright and fell down in 14 seconds, a 1,350-foot tall building. I said, this is controlled demolition, but I don't know how they did it. And so I Didn't want to make any public statements until I started doing a lot of research. And I've done an enormous amount of research as a trained structural engineer, and I've met with people in person.
Okay, if I could just step back
things.
just for one
Yes,
second.
sir.
So what we're getting to what the entire purpose of today's show is. This is the week of 9/11. So you're telling, just give what your overall premise is, that those planes did not take down those buildings. Is that what you're saying?
Well, we had several different things that happened. We'll get into the plane thing a little bit later, but I just want to lay a little bit more predicate. In June of 2001, the Rockefeller and John Hopkins had a thing called Operation Lockstep, where they were planning a pandemic in 2001. And then a month later in July, NASA had a thing called a 4-hour-long press conference called Future Wars 2025. You can go to TruthStream Media on YouTube or BitChute or Rumble and see this. And they had 100 PowerPoint slides, and they said that in order to have continuation of government, the people of the United States needed to have trauma-based mind control. And this is July 2001. Well, 3 months later, we get some trauma-based mind control. So in addition to that amount of predicate, in my studies, it was like, how did they manage to pull this off?
Okay, real quick. Who was it? So in July, this is 3 months before 9/11, and the Rockefeller Institute releases a study on
pandemics. And then also a month later, NASA does a program on Future Wars 2025. You can Google that, Future Wars 2025, and especially if you put in TruthStream Media. But they've got pictures of the whole thing, the program that they made, and it's like, we're going to have to traumatize the people in order to be able to impose tyranny on them.
So you're saying that this study that was released was sort of showing their cards. They were actually studying how do you control populations through mind control, and then boom, our towers go down.
Right. They were telling the insiders, this is what we're going to do to the people, so that when it happens, you'll be prepared and you'll be able to help us coordinate all of the public response to it. So going a little bit further, there was a lady named Susan Landauer who was a CIA...
Real quick, I'm sorry. When you say people, they were telling the people and how you control the public. Who are you referring to?
We're turning the puppet masters that are inside the government, the bureaucrats that are the ones that are in charge of making sure... And the news media, everybody that's in charge of creating this narrative, directed narrative, so that you know exactly, and it's all predictive programming. It's like, you're being told that you're going to be attacked, you're going to be hit by a pandemic. We're going to keep telling you over and over, and then, oh, it just accidentally happened. Well, no, it didn't accidentally happen. It happened on purpose.
So in one form or another, our media, or the corporate media, government bureaucrats, we don't know to what extent, to how far down it went, but they were sort of tipped off, hey, here's how you control people. And this is sort of like the prep for what's coming, 9/11 and the collapse of the towers. Okay.
Yeah. The Army had a group called Able Danger that was using the, I'm trying to remember the name. I'll remember it in a minute. But anyhow, they were using a computer program that did word search, and they were able to identify 6 of the quote hijackers, and they had been monitoring for 6 months. And they were disbanded when immediately after Baby Bush took office in 2001. And so this is a group of 40 guys that were in a group called Able Danger, and they had identified the Muhammad Atta group, and they were in the process of figuring out what was going on.
Okay, if I might say something. So then,
yes.
Essentially, I think that you're validating my opening monologue, where I essentially said they kicked off this malignment of a people with the Lavon affair in the 1950s, which was a small bomb attack framed on practicing Muslims, and then they consistently over time build it to bigger attacks, a bigger media propaganda effort, until we can get to the mother of all attacks, the 9/11, blamed it specifically on that world, and I believe to ensure that a nationalist trend never happens again in the Muslim world. They took, in fact, if I might just interject for 1 second, they took down Libya. They took down, over the past 70 years, they took down Libya. They replaced that government. That was attempting to go nationalist. They tried taking out Nasser in Egypt. They took out the Iranian government. There's now questions coming up about what was Saddam Hussein's real intentions in Iraq. Was he implementing a nationalist agenda? So I think that the premise is being laid out here between the both of us that Lavon affair was the first small, sort of like a low-level attempt. Progressively, they implemented their plan with their minions in our own communities to get the 9/11 attacks and completely malign a people and blame them for this and create the wars that happened. Did I sum it up well?
Well, the same directors that were in charge of the Opium War were also in charge of the colonialization of India, where they ended up killing 130 million. The Opium Wars killed 100 million. They were the Bolsheviks that killed 30 million during the Holodomor, and those were Christians. And they're the ones that are in charge of the massacre in Ukraine, where we've got 750,000 Christians that were killed there. So it's not just Muslims. It's these people are trying to go after every population possible because they believe that they can control the planet if the planet only has 500,000 people. And so if you've got to exterminate 8 billion people, you've got to do it in every way possible, and that's exactly what these people are up to. Now, getting back to Susan Landauer, she was a CIA asset. She had proof that there was going to be an attack in New York City, and she was prosecuted. She was jailed for about a year, and then when she managed to get the charges dropped, she wrote a book called Extreme Prejudice. And then we also had Zakaris Masari, who was hijacker number 20. Prior to 9/11, 4 different flight schools in the United States had reported Arab student anomalies. And that was one in San Diego, one in Oklahoma City, one in Florida, and one in Arizona. All of them reported. The FBI all dismissed any investigations in all of those. The guy that was in Oklahoma was a guy named Zakaris Masari. He left Oklahoma and he went up to Minneapolis, and he went to a place called Pan Am Flight School where they did flight simulations, and he said, I want to learn how to fly a 747. They said, well, fine, show us your logbook. And he showed him the logbook. He had 56 hours of dual time, and no flight instructor had signed him off to do a solo flight in a Cessna 150. And they said, well, I'm sorry, you won't be able to qualify for student loans. And he says, well, that's okay. How much is it going to cost? And they said, well, it's like $200 an hour. And he goes, well, I want 25 hours. And he gave him $5,000 cash and $100 bills. So they went, oh, okay, well, let's go ahead and schedule you. They contacted the FBI. Turns out he was here on an expired student visa, had no evidence of ever having occupied himself in the United States with any kind of a job. So he was arrested on August 16th, 2001 by the Minneapolis office. You got to see a video that Colleen Rowley, who was one of the arresting agents, did. They had 26 pages of evidence that they submitted to the headquarters in Washington, D.C., and they said, do not interrogate that prisoner and do not open his laptop. On September 4th, 2001, Robert Mueller was sworn in as head of the FBI. He covered up absolutely everything. We had a previous bombing event at the World Trade Center in 1993, February 1993, where they had framed a Muslim guy that said, we're going to give you a fake bomb because we're trying to do this, catch this, blind sheep that's really being a problem there in New York City. We're going to give you a van that's full of fake explosives. We're going to give you a fake detonator, and we need you to park it in the World Trade Center building and blow it up. Unknown to them, this guy was audio recording them. So once the bomb blew up in 1993, then he said, well, guess what? I've got audio recordings of you framing me for this, the same way the FBI framed everybody else. So not only did they completely ignore a threat vector in August of 2001, they tried to frame a guy for blowing up the World Trade Center in 1993.
Okay. And I apologize for interrupting you, but it's your content is so rich, and I'm just trying to slow you down a little bit because it's a lot for the audience to take in. So just to summarize what you're saying, there was a real threat from a man who had 50 hours of flight time, and he's out there trying to get a 747 license to fly. That guy's a real threat. They're ignoring him, giving him a pass, giving him a green light. Whereas this other man who has nothing to do with it, practicing Muslim, they frame him of the crime, or they attempt to anyways, is what you're saying.
Yeah. And so then we're moving up forward to the time of the actual event. And like I said, I was sitting there watching it on TV, and I went, this makes absolutely no sense to me at all. And so I started studying different things, and if you're listening on the radio, this is also going to be done with video where you can see the visual presentations, and you can rewind this as many times as possible, take notes, write questions. Chris and I will be happy to answer that at some future date. But part of my research, somebody told me that possibly the buildings were done with using nuclear bombs. And so this is one of the articles that I had, or one of the papers.
Don't put up the microphone so you can see where they can see it.
Okay, let's see. Okay, here we go. Ground Zero, the nuclear demolition of the World Trade Center. And this was by William Tahill in 2006. Then I also read the Fourth Generation Nuclear Weapons. This is by Andre Gosper.
It's kind of hard. There you go. That's your best.
There's my, yeah.
There you go.
We're in a 3-camera shoot, and I didn't know where the camera was.
Yep.
And then also, this is the U.S. Army's Staff Officer's Field Manual for Nuclear Deployment. We had actually miniaturized nuclear weapons to the point where we had nuclear bazookas in 1954, and they realized that you can't set off a nuclear bomb around other nuclear artillery shells without setting off all the shells. So they basically said, well, it doesn't look like we're going to be able to use tactical nukes except in very limited situations. But bottom line is they had miniaturized nuclear weapons to that particular extent.
So what you're saying is that the theory is that there was actually a miniature nuclear bomb put in the basements of the World Trade Centers.
We're going to get to that in just a second.
Okay.
So then there was a group called Architects and Engineers for 911 Truth, and they had a DVD premiere in Austin in May of 2009. Now, I had already been published one of my climate articles at InfoWars, and this was a 4-hour presentation, and Alex Jones was going to be there along with the founder of this group, Richard Gage. And so I went to that particular event, and I watched the side-by-side known controlled demolition of multiple high-rise buildings and the fall of the World Trade Center buildings, and it was like absolutely the same on two different. And I looked at the signed, sealed, stamped drawings from the structural engineer for the World Trade Center 1 and 2, and I'm very familiar with how steel buildings are built, and it was like, my God, there's no way that these things fell because planes hit them, number one, and number two, there's no way that these buildings fell from thermite because thermite cannot possibly do that. And so I started investigating it more and more. They ended up having additional meetings here in Houston with this particular group, and that's where I got this wonderful little piece of information. Let's see if I can find the right page. Anyhow, what they're saying in here.
Okay, so these engineers said that there's no way that a plane could take down these buildings. They're a steel fortress. These buildings were made for plane attacks.
Right, and that's the position of architects and engineers, and I don't disagree with them on that. But here's a direct quote. Thermite burns slowly relative to explosive materials. It takes 0.13 pounds of thermite required to heat each pound of steel to approximately 700 degrees, which is like 1,500 degrees Celsius, which is enough to make them deform but not make them melt. And since we have 100,000 tons of steel in each one of those buildings, you do the math, multiply times 0.13 pounds of thermite. It's an enormous amount of thermite. The stuff is really tricky material. It has really high temperature fuse requirements. It's usually set off by magnesium at 3,000 degrees in order to get it to fire. It burns at 4,000, which is enough to melt steel. Steel melts at 2,700 degrees, but steel vaporizes at 5,180 and Fahrenheit. And concrete melts at about 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. So you could melt concrete theoretically with that, and you can also melt steel, but you can't vaporize it. And what happened is the buildings were actually vaporized. We had 6 inches of dust that covered all of Manhattan, and you didn't do that with thermite.
Well, and then the other thing is that there's no way they can go down in 14 seconds. The building fell in 14 seconds.
That's correct.
And, you know, if it's just a plane hitting the building, how could it go down that fast? It would take, which, of course, the idea that a plane could take it down is increasingly getting questioned. But even if it could, how could it go down that fast?
Right. And then I pulled up the official government document on this. This is FEMA 403- or underline Chapter 2, WC World Trade Center 1 and 2. And I've taken screenshots from that particular thing, which we'll get to as I'm going into these. But bottom line is I was extremely well researched in how those buildings were built.
Let me give G2 a second here. G2, you got any commentary?
So
Go ahead, please.
when you look at the way these buildings came down, and you see the squibs that come out and the appearance of small explosions, specifically on Building 7. How did that happen? You know, if it wasn't thermite, what was it that did that?
Okay. Well, first of all, thermite is ferrous oxide aluminum. And so what you have is Fe2O3 aluminum 2. And if you have a 2,200 tons of aluminum sheeting on the exterior of the building, and you've got all of this steel, and you're able to actually vaporize that material, then what you have is iron molecules floating around in an oxygen-rich environment with aluminum molecules, and it will naturally form thermite. They found thermite in the dust. No thermite that was in the dust was involved in bringing those buildings down. And so that would be an additional amount of thermite that you would need in order to have it in the dust. But you can form thermite if you have iron molecules and aluminum molecules in an oxygen-rich environment. They will naturally form thermite nanoparticles. And nano is no stronger than regular thermite. The way you destroy a building by using explosives is to exceed the detonation velocity, which is the speed of sound inside the material. For steel, that's 6,100 meters per second. For concrete, it's 3,200 meters per second. The maximum thermite has ever been recorded is 895 meters per second. So thermite can't break apart steel and it can't break apart concrete, but a nuclear reaction with gamma rays coming up from the basement of the building can definitely do that. The shock wave will do it, and the heat from the thermodynamic.
If I can just get 1 second here. So again, just so the audience understands, what you're saying is that the steel beams in that building essentially vaporized. They turned to dust. Is that what you're saying?
Well, there was no debris field when you looked at the end of the building. So anyhow, I attended an event in Austin called the Austin Truth Fest, and this was on the 15th anniversary. This was 15 minutes away from where InfoWars were. They didn't bother to mention this particular rally, and they didn't report on it before or after. Speakers included Mark Anderson, Jim Mars, who's a renowned journalist, one of the best there is on the JFK assassination, and a key speaker was Christopher Bolin. I got Christopher Bolin's book, and he tells you exactly who was involved in the financial arrangements before and after this particular event. I'll let him do his own discussion. You can look up Christopher Bolin on YouTube.
And so you're saying that there are parties, I would say I always refer to them as the billionaire class of the world, the elite billionaire class. You're saying they had investments already laid down that would turn a profit if those buildings crashed.
Well, they did what is called short sale on the airlines and the insurance industries. And then also Cantor Fitzgerald had 400 people in their office, and they were doing bond sales that day for bonds that were issued 10 years earlier to the Bush gang that were Operation Hammer, where they went in and with bond money that they borrowed and bought up all of the Russian industries as the Bolsheviks revolution ended. But quickly moving along, because we're going to be running out of time here, I was contacted in 2018 by Robert David Steele.
And he passed away, correct?
He was actually murdered, but yeah, we don't have time to get into that. But yeah, he had ivermectin in his possession, but he wasn't taking it prophylactically, and he got sick, and his wife wasn't there, and they put him in the hospital, put him on a ventilator, gave him remdesivir, and snuffed him. But anyhow, he had contacts inside the Donald Trump administration in the cabinet level people, and he said, I'm going to write a memo because in 2016 Trump promised that he was going to declassify the JFK files and he was declassify the files on 9/11, everything that was held by the national security state, and he did neither one of those. And he also said, I love WikiLeaks when WikiLeaks was disclosing things on the DNC leaks. But then when he got in, he said, well, I've never heard of Julian Assange. I've never heard of WikiLeaks. Well, had he pardoned Julian Assange in 2021 or in 2017, there would have been no Russiagate, because we would have proven that the Democrats completely tried to rig that election. But bottom line, that's just one of the things that I have against Donald Trump. But what Robert David Steele said was that I've collected these 28 authors, and I've met about half of these people or talked to them on the phone. I've got 28 authors, and we can put a memo in front of the president, but he won't read anything that's more than 2 pages long, and he won't read anything that doesn't have a picture. So I wrote an article called Memorandum to the President, Twin Towers Destroyed Using Clean Nukes. And this shows the explosion of the World Trade Center building. You see this giant column of smoke coming up out of the building, and then you see it cascading over the sides. Looks exactly like a volcano. A volcano is a fission reaction. Earth at 700,000 cubic miles of uranium, 1.2 million cubic miles of thorium. They're constantly decaying. They're producing heat. They're producing daughter atoms, and they're erupting out of volcanoes all over the planet. And so this is exactly what happened. It was pyroclastic flow coming out of those buildings.
And you sent that letter to who?
Well, it was sent to Trump, but he never saw it because it never made it past the gatekeepers there in the White House. So next year, I was contacted by Coast to Coast AM. They wanted me to do a program, and I'd already been on Coast to Coast several times, 615 radio stations, 2 million listeners. So I thought, well, they've already interviewed Judy Woods, who's the directed energy hoaxer, and Richard Gage, and so I thought, man, maybe they'll talk to me about nukes. So I wrote an article called Unequivocal 911 Nukes. This shows the exterior of the building. This is a Vanderveer truss. These are 3-story tall welded sections that were made at boatyards across the Hudson, brought over on barges, and then swung into the building. The horizontal bands on the World Trade Center building, those are 52-inch high, 2-inch thick plate steel. They're welded top and bottom to the bar joist on each floor. They have shear ties that are laced through the bar joists that are welded to that outside spandrel section. And then they had 6 inches of concrete that was poured on top of that. There's no way that a plane went through that, number one. And there's number two, there's no way that they were able to fall due to that particular event.
But we all saw a plane go through it.
Well, we'll get into that later. So then, after I published this article at Veterans Today, I was contacted by one of my readers. They said, you need to read the Palmer Report. The Palmer Report was written by 4 PhD physicists in Europe, and this is a 110-story tall building. This is a 110-story tall building. This is a 47-story tall building, which is Building 7, which fell in 7 seconds, and then Building 6 is 7 stories tall, looks like a nuclear volcano. I sent this to the editor at Veterans Today, Gordon Duff, and he said, my God, these guys have proven everything that we've written in 80 articles under nuclear education at Veterans Today. And at that point, I had read every one of those and studied them. Some of them took a day for me to go research everything, so I understood exactly the concepts. But
and everyone asked that question. I think G2, didn't you ask about Building 7?
Well, yes. I mean, there's never been an explanation of what happened there that made sense, right? And for folks that aren't as deep in this as you are, I'm not certainly as deep as you are, but I never really questioned Building 7 because I had no reason to think about it much. You know, it wasn't reported heavily on. And then you started to see the reports that the BBC announced the collapse of Building 7 before it actually fell, which raised some questions. And then the University of Fairbanks came out with a report and the report didn't say what brought Building 7 down. It simply said that the official story that Building 7 collapsed because of a fire in a subway tunnel that caused the simultaneous collapse of 95% of the supporting columns in that building. That is a preposterous impossibility, could not happen. So if you just start with that and say the official story of Building 7 is clearly not true, and then people make the joke often, well, did Building 7 just fall because it was sad that its friends 1 and 2 went down? I mean, it's sort of a little dark humor, but it begins to show the ridiculousness of the story.
Yes, the architects and engineers from 911 Truth have a great little 5-minute video using the Richard Petty song about falling down, and it's really good. But bottom line is, that's Leroy Halsey, who's a PhD structural engineer at University of Fairbanks, and I watched all of his seminars as they were produced. He does a great job of saying what didn't happen, but he doesn't tell you at all what did happen. So,
well, I suspect that's why he still has a job at the University of Fairbanks.
Right. It's a thin line you got to walk, and that's why it's just people that are highly informed and that have done an enormous amount of research and that are not threatened by business or familial ties that have the courage to be able to stand up and talk about all this stuff. But then these guys made a casual reference to the fact that iron has 4 stable isotopes. Well, I've been studying chemistry and nuclear reactions at a college professor's level for decades. And so I thought, well, if iron has 4 stable isotopes, how many radioactive does it have? Oh, that's 24. What else is a concrete and steel building built with? Well, you have iron and carbon, which makes up the steel, and then you have carbon, calcium, and silicon, which makes up the concrete. So carbon has 2 stable, 13 radioactive. Calcium has 5 stable, 21 radioactive, and silicon has 3 stable and 20 radioactives. So the majority of those are radioactive. The radioactivity lasts for a half-life of 90 days. The buildings were 2,500 degrees hot until December. You didn't do that with thermite, and you didn't do that with directed energy weapons. The only way you did that is that the building materials themselves absorbed the gamma rays, which reduced the nuclear signature, and in the process they turned into isotopes that fell down into the pit, and the pit ended up being 2,500 degrees hot with continuous water poured on it 24/7 until December. So the only way you did that was because these were nuclear isotopes, nuclides, that were formed as a result of the destruction of the buildings using nuclear bombs.
Just to summarize, what you're saying is that nuclear bombs were set off. It created an internal inferno at the base of those buildings that's unimaginable. Took them months to get that temperature down, and it was radioactive. It was a radioactive center for some time.
And the site's still radioactive, and that's why they put reflection ponds over the highest incidence areas, because they wanted to reduce and it was prohibited to have radio Geiger counters in that area.
Okay, real quick. So right now, people that work in New York City are working in a radioactive zone.
Well, everything's radioactive. The planet's just, we live in a radioactive zone.
Right, but to a point...
But it's the ambient's high enough, and there was also radioactivity in radioactive isotopes, serenium, and a bunch of others that were in the dust that would.
But is it like at a dangerous level in New York City?
Well,
or was it at one time?
It was, yeah.
For how long?
Well, the cloud that blew past Manhattan traveled to the northeast, and that's Brooklyn and Bronx got covered with it, and it takes 20 years to get nuclear exposure cancers. And so you had a whole cluster of cancers that were in New York City that these people had been there for the lifetime, didn't move, and they'd been exposed for 20 years, and they were suddenly developing all these rare lung cancers. And presto, that's where you had 20,000 people that were rushed into the hospital and given remdesivir and snuff because they would end up being a cancer cluster that would be obvious to people. So that's another nefarious thing that they did. After I reviewed the Palmer report, I said, well, these guys are pretty smart, but they missed a few things. And part of it was the jokes that are being played by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which is NIST. And so in addition to the isotope material, I wrote an additional article at Veterans Today called Exposing 911, the NIST Jenga Game. And this has plates that are actually from, again, the FEMA report, and these show sections that were inside the building. So you have the exterior spandrel section, which is again the 2-inch thick, 2-inch high, 2-inch thick, 52-inch high steel bands that went around the exterior of the building. This shows the bar joists connected top and bottom. And so bottom line is, when you blow out the whole center of a building and your center floors are connected to it, the center floors are going to collapse into a triangular area. As they collapse, they're going to start pulling in the wall sections that were on the outside.
Okay, I got a question. When it happened, Donald Trump at the time, he was not president. He was a real estate developer. And I believe he was interviewed by Alex Jones, and he said something to the effect of, "There's no way that planes took these buildings down."
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not. What?
Well, okay.
I
First
mean,
of all,
did he say it? He said that, correct?
yes. First of all, we're getting back to these spandrels. I mean, these Vandermeer truss sections that are the 3-story sections on the exterior of the building. This is your horizontal spandrel section. These are your vertical columns, which are 16 inches square.
And for the listening audience, he's showing the building with the image of the plane that supposedly penetrated it, created a hole.
Right. And then all of these joints between these different spandrel sections had 12 bolts each. The columns were bolted top and bottom to each other, and then the floor joists were connected on all floors. You have complete panels that are completely missing. This would not be a normal failure plane. No airplane could knock out a complete panel like that. And the photos of the panels and stuff that were laying on the ground had no shear around those holes. There was no shear around the holes where they were bolted side to side along the spandrels, and none on the end caps. So those things had been pre-cut. The building was only 50% occupied. There was a group called the Gelatin Group that was in there for 90 days. Prior to this, it was doing all the setup. They were going in with their plasma guns and cutting out the bolts, cutting out the bar joists, bracing stuff up, planting charges inside the building to blow out these 2 panels to give you the Roadrunner image.
So the Gelatin Group, who were they? Who are these people?
Well, you can look that up. We don't really get into that. Bottom line is they were authorized to be in the building. And then you also had an elevator company that had never existed before and never existed afterward that was in there doing revisions to the elevator panels. And Marvin Bush was in charge of the company that was in charge of building security. So now, if you look at this as an actual photo of the exterior of the building, you can see where the 2 panels were blown out of the building, but then you can also see the sideways swipe, and these show deflection as something hit the side of the building. If you're going to...
He's showing a hole in the side of the building that looks like a plane possibly hit it.
And there again, this you can find this at Chapter 2, VEMA. It's, let's see, it's on the same page with the page 218, and it's in figure number 215. So bottom line is, there was no airlines that hit. The objects that hit the building were traveling at 500 miles per hour. A passenger jet has what's called a high bypass turbofan. It's got a little tiny turbine inside the fan, but then it's just a big shrouded fan on the outside. At 30,000 foot altitude, you've got a quarter of the amount or a tenth of the amount of atmosphere. You can push a lot of air through there, and when you push the air out of the back of that turbine, you get an enormous amount of thrust. You can fly 500 miles per hour. But at 1,000 foot altitude, the atmosphere is so thick that it will absolutely rip the engines off of the plane. Vmax for a 767, which hit those 2 buildings at 1,000 foot altitude, is only 250 miles per hour. So if something's traveling 500 miles per hour, it wasn't a jet airplane. But you needed something to give you a soundtrack of something before it hit the building. And then you also needed to have something that you could center your CGI of an airplane hitting the building. And if you look at the people that have done video analysis, they show the airplane going completely through the building and out the other side because they weren't able to stop the CGI quick enough, and they didn't edit it, and you can find those clips online. So
Okay,
bottom line,
so what was it that hit the building then?
the missiles hit the building and missiles hit the Pentagon. And then nothing hit Saintsville. There was no airplane debris found at any of those sites. There was no black boxes. There was no jet engines. There was no landing gear, luggage, seats. The only thing they found was a couple of passports. The bodies, there were 3,000 people that were in the building that were destroyed. They were able to identify fragments from BB-sized pieces of bone fragments on adjoining buildings for 1,500 of those people. There's no way you did that with thermite. There's no way you did that with directed energy. There's no way you did that with conventional explosives. The only way you could blow that many people to pieces and scatter them over that large an area was using nuclear bombs. And this would be something in the range of a 1 to 2 kiloton bomb.
So would they shoot them from? A plane or what?
No, the bombs were placed in.
But you said the holes at the top were they were missiles, correct?
Yes.
Were they shot from
well,
a
you
plane, fighter jet, or what?
No, they switched them out at an airport in the western Massachusetts. The two flights that came from Boston both intersected at the airport at the same time. The flights landed there, but at the same time they sent drones up that had transponders that mimicked and they were doing a live action hijacking at NORAD, and NORAD had already transferred 2/3 of the NORAD fleet out of the Northeast, and then they had 20 different radar images. If you go to Pilots for 911, you can find this particular
Real quick,
information.
we got 5 minutes.
Okay, that's why I wanted to get back to the rest of this.
I want to ask you, who did it?
Well, you could probably say it's the people that benefited financially from it, and that would be the United States military-industrial complex, because there was a group called the Project for the New American Century. This is a bunch of neocons, and they had written a paper that said that the United States needed to overthrow 7 Middle Eastern governments, but they weren't going to do it without having a new Pearl Harbor. Well, presto, they gave us a new Pearl Harbor. And then what did we do? We went in and attacked Afghanistan, and then erroneously attacked Iraq, which you can prove that there was no weapons of mass destruction. I've met Scott Ritter. I've got his book. And he's absolutely correct. He was a weapons inspector on that. And after we overthrew those two countries, we had bookended Iran, but we weren't able to coax Iran into getting into a fight so that we could take over Iran, which is one of the principles. But then when Obama was in office, he had a CIA program called Operation Zero Footprint, where they did the Arab Spring, and they armed the Muslim Brotherhood to overthrow the governments of Tunisia, Yemen, Egypt, and Libya. And when they overthrew the government of Libya, they had another CIA operation called Timber Sycamore, where they shipped all of Libya's weapons through Turkey to arm ISIS so they could overthrow Syria. So there you have it. They're trying to overthrow all of these Middle Eastern governments, and they're doing it by doing false flags.
And G2, I got to ask you, is there anything you hear that Joseph is saying that you don't agree with, like you think it's too far out there?
Well, I've got a lot of questions, and
we got 4 minutes, but yeah.
Yeah, so this would require another conversation.
And that's what we'll have.
Go ahead. You finish it up, Joseph.
Yeah.
You
okay.
close us out.
So bottom line is, I studied the structure of this particular building. When the World Trade Center was built, New York City is built on granite bedrock, but the granite bedrock has 40 feet of glacial till, and that's from when there was 1,000-foot high ice shield on top of New York. And when that ice melted, it dropped 40 feet of rubble and dirt. And that's what New York is built on top of. So when they got ready to build the basement of the building, they got down to the granite and they went, gee, we can't blast through this granite without knocking out the 100-foot berm that's between us and the Hudson River. And the Hudson River is only 15 feet below grade level, the water in the river, and it would just flood this site and then get down and flood the whole entire Manhattan. So they built a bathtub around it, so no part of the building was less than 6 stories deep. But they planted a nuclear bomb in elevator number 50, which is a central elevator, and it was the only one with a continuous shaft that went from the basement all the way up to the top. The other shafts they were able to blow out with explosives that happened in intermediate floors so they could create a complete hollow in the center of the building. They planted the nuclear bomb on that. The granite worked as a lens and a tamper. It reduced the rate of radioactive production from the nuclear bomb, and it also focused every bit of it up right through the center of the building so it could eat out the whole entire core, blow the material out of the center of the top of the building, and then drag the building down inside of it. And when the whole thing was over, if you look at the plate number 45, posted with the Palmer Report at Veterans Today, you can see a 100-foot deep hole that was underneath the building where the steel actually fell down inside that hole.
I want to say, Joseph, man, I find this totally fascinating.
I'll debate anybody in the world on this material.
There you have it. The debate is out there. We'll do it on this show. We're in our last 30 seconds here. This is so much information. Obviously, we can't cover it all in the short time that we have. I want to thank Joseph for being on the show. G2, I want to thank you for being on the show. We got to do this one again because it's just simply too much information. But, wow, this is fascinating stuff. Thank you very much. This is Chris Heasley with The Chris Heasley Show. We'll see you back here next Saturday at 10 a.m.